As the persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire ended in the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine converted, there was an increase in the scale and organisation of monasticism. Without persecution, asceticism became the means to recapturing the glory of martyrdom. Asceticism was a kind of self-martyrdom. St. Anthony the Great renounced the world and went into the Egyptian desert. Many would follow his example, and he has therefore been known as the father of monasticism. As many monks attained the heights of spirituality, many anecdotes and quotes were recorded in writing in a book called Sayings of the Desert Fathers. Its impact was immense. It was translated into many languages and spread through the Christian nations very quickly, and still is a source of inspiration for Christians today. The Latin translation had a particularly transformative effect in Gaul. From chapter 3, part 2 of Father Seraphim Rose's Vita Patrum, we can read, "The heart of the Christian life of early Orthodox Gaul was monasticism. Orthodox monasticism sprang up on the soil of Gaul almost as soon as news of the great Egyptian fathers reached the West, and once Christian Gaul had been given the example of its first great native monastic saint, St. Martin of Tours, its monastics already numbered in the thousands, some 2,000 of whom attended the funeral of St. Martin in 397. With the founding of the monastery of Leirin in the Egyptian tradition at the dawn of the new century and the writings of St. John Cassian on the spiritual teaching of the Egyptian fathers early in the 5th century, the golden age of monasticism in Gaul may be said to have begun. We know of the founding of some 200 monasteries in Gaul in the next 2 centuries, and probably there were many more, and the wonder-working saints from among these communities were already past counting. St. John Cassian is a very important part of the history of the establishment of a deliberately Egyptian-styled monasticism in Gaul. He was neither from Egypt nor Gaul, but Scythia Minor, a region that is split between Romania and Bulgaria on a modern map. Seeking the monastic life, as a young man he travelled to the deserts of Palestine and Egypt and spent almost 20 years there. He left the fight against Origenism, which took him to Alexandria, Constantinople, where he became a deacon of St. John Chrysostom until his exile, and Rome. At Rome, the offer was made to him to establish monasteries in Gaul based upon his experience in Egypt. He accepted, travelled to Gaul, and established a monastery there. St. John Cassian was an inspiration to many by his example and his writings. In particular, he was an inspiration to and great supporter of St. Honoratus and his island monastery at Leirin. Also, 2 of St. John Cassian's books are classics of monastic literature, the Institutes and the Conferences. He encouraged others to follow the Egyptian example. Also from Vita Patrum, and referring to the Institutes, the book is dedicated to Castor, Bishop of Apt, a short distance north of Marseille, who had just established a Cenobitic monastery in his diocese. In his introduction, St. Cassian explains what is demanded of him and what he intends to give. Desiring that the Cenobitic monasteries in your region should be ordered according to the rules of the Eastern, and in particular the Egyptian monasteries, you demand of me, poor in word and knowledge, that I set forth those monastic rules which I saw in Egypt and Palestine, and of which I heard from the fathers, so that the brethren of your monastery might know the way of life which the saints led there. This removed the necessity of travelling to Egypt. We can underestimate the link between Egypt and France by expecting a significant movement of people between the 2 countries. However, this was understood to not be necessary, and perhaps even a waste of time and energy. One could be inspired by Egypt without visiting it, and even St. John Cassian said so. Again from Vita Patrum, as such monastic settlements grew in 5th century Gaul, the need to go to Egypt to see the Christian desert became less and less urgent. It was above all St. John Cassian who put to rest the idea of going to the East for monastic training, when he provided in his books the spiritual teaching of the great elders of Egypt. When he heard that St. Eucherius, even after being in Leirin, was thinking of going to Egypt, he dedicated to him and to his great Abba, St. Honoratus, 7 books of his conferences with this preface. And the preface goes on to conclude that his writings are to divert the latter from the necessity of a dangerous voyage. Now we can see how the monasticism of Egypt came to Gaul, and it is time to see how it then came from Gaul to Ireland. St. Patrick is known as the Enlightener of Ireland, as his mission led to the conversion of the majority of the Irish people to Christianity. His life story is well known. He was a Briton, captured by Irish pirates as a teenager, and taken to work in the fields. He prayed to God to return to his family, and his prayers were answered, and he escaped. The experience gave him the desire to dedicate his life to developing his faith. He therefore left his family to seek an advanced education. The significance of where he gained this education is not often reflected upon. He joined the monastery of Tours that had been established by St. Martin, and then later at Layrin Abbey, established by St. Honoratus with especially close links to St. John Cassian. He would also study under St. Germanus of Auxerre, one of the great saints of Gaul, and later go to Rome before returning to Ireland. Tirchan's Collectanea says that St. Patrick came to Ireland on his mission with his Gauls. And so from the beginning of St. Patrick's mission, there's a strongly Gallic inspiration, which as we now know is in turn a strongly Egyptian inspiration. In a previous video, I discussed the pre-patrician saints, those saints who were before St. Patrick's mission. One of these was St. Palladius, who was a bishop from Gaul. Even before him was the first Irish saint, St. Kieran of Sagir, who, just like St. Patrick, studied in Tours and Layrin. They actually met before St. Patrick returned to Ireland. St. Ibar of Begarin was also a pre-patrician saint. He was a druid until he met some missionaries who came from Tours. Inspired by them, he went to Layrin Abbey. At this point, it should be clear that Tours and Layrin stand out as the initial inspirations for Irish monasticism. It is difficult to do justice to the greatness of Clonard Abbey. Anyone who is not in awe of Clonard has not studied Irish monasticism. Everyone who knows the basics knows that Clonard is absolutely key. Its founder was St. Finian of Clonard, and his monastery grew to the size of a settlement, with 3,000 monks and many more laymen and their families in its vicinity. Such illustrious saints and founders of great monastic sites in their own right as St. Columba of Iona, St. Comgall of Bangor, St. Brendan of Birr, St. Kenny of Agabo, St. Kieran of Clonmacnoise, St. Leisrin and St. Rua of Laura were trained in Clonard. With the connection of St. Columba, even Lindisfarne could be considered as under the inspiration of Clonard. And where did St. Finian of Clonard gain his template of how a monastery should be run? At Tours. The legacy of St. Martin of Tours is directly connected to Clonard, and in turn the majority of Irish monastic foundations. Tours and Gallic monasticism, as has already been shown, is directly connected to Egyptian monasticism. This video has shown the Egyptian influence on Ireland as it came via Gaul. However, there was even an influence that came direct from Egypt. The historical evidence for this includes the reference to 7 Egyptian monks buried in Ireland in the Martyrology of Angus, the Ballycotton brooch, which has Arabic writing on it, St. Olin's stone, which has the inscription, "Pray for Olin the Egyptian," although some say it reads, "Pray for Cormac the Egyptian," all agree that it says "the Egyptian." And also the Fadden Moor Psalter, which was lined with papyrus, of course a material and technique not native to Ireland and very much associated with Egypt.
لأنه صالح